In May 1453, the Cathedral of Segovia turned into a stage of spectacle that no one in Castile would ever forget. A show of humiliation and boldness that surpassed everything the medieval court had ever witnessed. Inside the hall, under its tall arches, bishops and courtiers gathered, dressed in splendid clothes of silk and gold. But those who appeared that day were not noble ladies or valiant knights, but women from the streets, representatives of that world into which a decent person never looked without necessity. They were invited not to be judged but to appear as witnesses and defenders. Their assignment was as strange as it was improper, to prove that the heir to the crown of Castile, Prince Enrique, was not lacking in manly power. Each of them had to declare that she had spent the night with him and that she had no doubt about his ability. Meanwhile, in the same building, in another chamber, something equally humiliating was taking place. Princess Blanche of Navarre, Enrique's legitimate wife after 13 years of marriage, was forced to undergo an examination that in itself became a stigma of shame. A group of respected matrons, women from noble houses, were required to testify to her physical condition. The result stunned everyone who was present. After all those years of official marriage, she remained untouched. The picture unfolding before the Castilian court amazed everyone. On one side, the women of the streets swore to the prince's virility. On the other, his lawful wife was compelled to confirm her innocence in front of all Europe. And this happened not somewhere on the edge of the kingdom, but in the very heart of Castilian justice, in the royal tribunal, where matters of the state were decided and not the issues of the marital bed. But this was the defense Enrique had chosen. He did not deny the failure of his marriage. On the contrary, he presented it as proof of some mysterious force. His version sounded unbelievable. He was capable and free with other women, but next to his wife, it was as if an invisible obstacle deprived him of every possibility. A curse, witchcraft, a shadow of someone else's evil will. These were the only explanations that the prince and his counselors considered acceptable. The church's language even used a special expression, impotentia ex maleficio, helplessness caused by sorcery. And still, the dry and formal language of the protocols could not convey the full horror of what was happening. Behind the walls of the cathedral, whispers began to grow. This hearing would become the beginning of a chain of events that would not only destroy the lives of two people, but would also involve entire kingdoms, leading to struggles for the throne and bringing new rulers whose names would later be associated with the greatest changes in European history. To understand how it could happen that one of the most powerful princes of the continent found himself in court, where women of easy virtue spoke in his favor while his wife was being examined for purity, one must turn back time. To return to the day when the young heir stood before the altar for the first time, and when the entire court believed that this marriage would bring peace and unite the two opposing crowns. September 1440. The great cathedral in Valladolid shone with golden candlelight, the walls covered with embroidered fabrics and precious decorations, and the organ resounded as if heaven itself was bending over this union. Here, among hundreds of guests who held their breath, stood the 15-year-old heir of Castile, thin, awkward, with facial features already marked by the shadow of illnesses that had followed him since childhood. Constant fatigue, weakness, sudden mood swings. All of this could not escape the eyes of the courtiers. Yet on that day, they did not look at his frailty, but at the brilliance of the future. Next to him stood his bride, 16-year-old Blanche of Navarre, educated, refined, raised in the traditions of the French court. She spoke 4 languages and carried herself as though she had been preparing for the crown all her life. For her mother, the Queen of Navarre, this marriage was the pinnacle of diplomatic mastery, a way to unite two rival houses and protect her kingdom from bloody border wars. The marriage was blessed by one of the most influential cardinals of Castile. Everything appeared like a flawless chess match, where two crowns were about to merge into one power. Crowds of nobles, clergy, and courtiers filled the cathedral, and the ceremony itself seemed to promise a peaceful future. But this story had another act. The night when the marriage had to be confirmed not by words but by action. In those times, the union of monarchs was considered not a personal but a state matter. The walls of the bedroom did not close tightly. Bishops, doctors, courtiers, and even servants gathered behind the door. Their presence was meant to guarantee that the union was physically sealed. The symbol of completion was the morning presentation of the sheets showing the traces of the first intimacy. That night they waited in vain. The hours passed, and behind the door, there was nothing but heavy silence. The morning brought not joy but whispers. People said that young Enrique seemed paralyzed. He did not look at his wife as if frightened by her closeness. Others claimed that the presence of those waiting outside had frozen him in terror. When the patience of the courtiers ran out, the doctors were called. Their conclusion was clear and final. The union remained incomplete. The Queen of Navarre tried to smooth over the embarrassment, assuring everyone that the young couple simply needed time. But soon, she returned home, leaving her daughter in a foreign court full of intrigue and suspicion. A year later, she died suddenly, an end many believed to be the result of poison, though no proof was ever found. Blanche was left alone in a country where, instead of support, she met coldness and indifference. And beyond the mountains, in Navarre, her father was already building new plans, paying no attention to his daughter's feelings or position. From that moment on, Blanche became a figure that could be sacrificed for more favorable alliances. The years passed, and the strange marriage of the two young rulers turned into a farce watched by the entire court with growing bewilderment. Enrique and Blanche lived under the same roof, attended the same ceremonies, dinners, and services, but their union existed only on paper. The spouses hardly spoke to each other, as if an invisible wall stood between them. In public, they walked hand in hand, but in private, they maintained a distance that only deepened with time. Blanche, brought up with French refinement, tried to preserve her dignity. Every morning, she rose at dawn and went to Mass. She prayed for change and patiently hoped for a miracle. But the miracle never came. Rumors about the strange life inside the royal bedchamber soon spread throughout the court. The neighbors whispered that Enrique did not avoid women at all. On the contrary, his frequent disappearances and secret visits to the bedrooms of his favorites caused arguments even among the servants. The prince's confessor often urged him to give up such visits and to remember his wife, yet all the advice vanished without effect. Wine, music, and nighttime secret meetings took the place that should have belonged to his lawful spouse. The maids knew that the guards at the side gates were generously paid for their silence, and the servants had long learned to shut their eyes to those nightly visits. As time passed, despair pushed Enrique to seek unusual methods. Italian physicians promised a cure for an enormous sum of money. They brought exotic powders, infusions of rare herbs, and even a powder made from the horn of a rhinoceros, a rarity brought by sea. The prince swallowed everything without hesitation, but the result remained unchanged. Then came spices, whole chests of coriander, amber, and resins known as the dragon's blood, which were sold as miraculous remedies. His food became so oversaturated with spices that the maids whispered the prince smelled like a spice market. Still, nothing changed. Desperation forced him to attempt more extreme measures. Doctors prescribed ointments that burned his skin and brought suffering. Once he was so wounded by these treatments that he could not rise from bed for weeks. There were even darker notes in the chronicles. It was said that Enrique lay beside his wife while servants struck his body with whips, hoping that pain would awaken what remained lifeless. For Blanche, it was humiliation she endured in silence, keeping the mask of royal dignity. She, a young woman raised at the refined court of Navarre, had to suffer rituals close to torture and yet smile in society as though nothing unusual was happening. But it was in those very years that something occurred which turned the perception of this strange story upside down. In the spring of 1447, Blanche took a step that, for a woman of that time, was almost unthinkable. She turned not to her husband, not to the priests of the court, but directly to the Pope. In her letter, which is still preserved in the Vatican archives, the tone was not one of despair but of alarm. She wrote that she feared not for herself but for her husband's soul, because people at court whispered about secret rituals, nocturnal ceremonies, and forces that should not exist in a Christian kingdom. This cry for help went unanswered, or its reply was destroyed. Yet a few months later, the court magician was suddenly dismissed. His chambers were sealed, and the objects found there were burned before the entire court. Priests read the prayers of banishment while smoke rose above the flames. Thus appeared the first official explanation. The marriage was said to be under the influence of enchantment. And although today it may sound like myth, in the 15th century it became a convenient formula that excused the future king from accusations of physical defect. For everyone involved in the drama, it meant only one thing. The prince now had a legal justification, and Blanche received the first warning that her destiny would soon be determined not in the bedroom but on the political stage. By the middle of the century, the political landscape around Blanche had changed beyond recognition. Her father, King Juan II, had long shown that family ties were merely instruments to him. He already had a new wife and a son, Ferdinand, to whom he assigned a great future, and the daughter who remained in Castile with her husband, who had not touched her for more than 10 years, gradually lost all value in his eyes. When enmity broke out between Juan himself and his son Carlos, Blanche's brother, Castile supported not the father but the son. At that moment, the princess's position changed dramatically. From a bridge between two crowns, she turned into the daughter of an enemy. For courtiers who wished to remove a political threat, that became a signal to act. In January 1453, Enrique made a decision that had been prepared for a long time. He submitted an official petition to annul the marriage. The formal justification was ready. 13 years of life together without an heir and rumors of a witch's curse that prevented the union. But one thing was words, another was evidence. The church demanded confirmation, which meant a public hearing. In the spring of 1453, a church tribunal was convened. Bishop Luis Vasquez de Acuña presided, surrounded by crowds of nobles who came not for theological interest but for amusement. They said the cathedral had never seen such a number of witnesses, from respected aristocrats to curious young courtiers eager to hear scandalous details. First, Blanche entered the hall. She was 29. She still keeps her beauty and dignity, but in her eyes one can notice the years of humiliation and loneliness. She is forced to remain standing, not being allowed to sit, as if to remind everyone that now she is the accused and no longer the queen. The question sounds cold. Will she swear that she has remained untouched? Blanche answers firmly that she will swear. But one answer is not enough. In front of the entire court, the appointed matrons take her into a separate room. What happened there was not written in detail, but the result was recorded, that the princess really preserved her virginity. One of the women later confesses in her personal notes that the whole commission cried from sorrow at that moment, seeing her endurance. And then it was Enrique's turn. And here the process turned into a performance. Instead of defending himself, the prince organized a spectacle. Women were invited to the hall whose names were well known: Mariela Flores, Catalina de Sandoval, and Beatriz, called the Portuguese. They were not random girls from the streets but famous courtesans who knew how to speak and understood the rules of the court. Each one told separately what happened with the prince and that none of them doubted his strength. One described marks on his body that only someone close could know. Another produced papers of payment from the royal treasury for her services, as if showing that this was not secret but part of the official budget. And the third delivered the final blow. She said that Enrique himself told her that with any woman he felt free, but next to his wife he felt as if he was bound in chains. The effect was stunning. Silence filled the hall, mixed with whispers. All this turned a private tragedy into a spectacle where the honor and future of the queen were publicly destroyed. But the court wanted more. Then an unexpected witness appeared, Marquis Santillana. The respected statesman presented the letter of the doctor who had treated Enrique for many years. He claimed that he had found strange signs on his body, as if traces of charms that appeared and disappeared with the moon's cycles. For a modern ear it sounds like superstition, but for the judges of the middle 15th century it became convincing proof. An hour after the beginning of the meeting, the bishop returned with the decision. The marriage was declared null and void because it was destroyed by evil force. Enrique was recognized as capable of married life and therefore free for a new union. The hall exploded. Some applauded, others remained silent, shocked by how far the process had gone. Blanche silently bowed and left the hall. From that moment, her life no longer belonged to Castile, to Navarre, or to herself. When Blanche left the cathedral, her fate was already determined. Formally, she ceased to be the wife and heiress of Castile, but in fact she lost everything. Her jewels, presented on the wedding day, were declared the property of the crown. Servants were ordered to collect her belongings, and her title disappeared along with the court's decision. She could take only what she had brought from Navarre 13 years earlier. But returning home was not salvation. In the summer of the same year, when she crossed the Navarre border, she was met not by her family's embrace but by her father's cold order. Juan II commanded to arrest his daughter. The formal reason was her correspondence with her brother Carlos, Prince of Viana, whom Juan considered his enemy. In reality, everything was simpler. After the annulment of the marriage, Blanche became the direct heiress of Navarre, and that made her dangerous for the plans of her father and his new family. She was locked in the castle where she had spent her childhood. Through the windows of her cell, she could see the same gardens where the little princess had once played. But now she looked at them as a prisoner deprived of her future. Her name was used as a figure in other people's games, and even her brothers and sisters were drawn into the plot against her. While Blanche languished in imprisonment, Enrique in Castile did not waste time. In the summer, negotiations began about his new marriage. The Portuguese court treated this proposal cautiously. Rumors about the trial in Segovia had already reached Lisbon. But finally, the terms were settled, and by the beginning of 1454 the contract was signed. In May 1455 the wedding with Joan of Portugal took place. This time everything was organized differently. There were no crowds behind the doors, no witnesses, only the spouses and one trusted servant by the threshold. In the morning it was announced that the union had been consummated. For a while this quieted the court. Castile now had a queen, and the hope for the birth of an heir seemed near. Yet the years went by and no child appeared. Rumors returned again. In foreign courts Enrique was more and more often called the impotent king, and abroad the ambassadors of Castile became objects of ridicule. Still, in February 1462 the court burst with news that the queen had given birth to a daughter. The child was named Juana. Celebrations lasted for a week, and for the first time in many years the king looked truly happy. But the joy did not last. In the palaces people whispered that the real father of the girl might be the queen's favorite, the young and handsome Beltrán de la Cueva. The rumors matched the dates, and his closeness to Joan had long gone unnoticed. Those conversations were not only slander, they struck the very heart of the monarchy. After all, if the girl was not Enrique's daughter, the right to the throne became uncertain. And slowly this shadow of doubt turned into a weapon in the hands of those who wished to overthrow the king. By 1464 the suspicions about the heiress could no longer be silenced. The nobles who had recently supported Enrique united under the leadership of Juan Pacheco and demanded proof. They produced testimonies of servants who claimed that the king and queen had never shared a bed. There were witnesses who had seen Beltrán leaving Joan's chamber at dawn. And there was the letter of the Archbishop of Toledo, in which the spiritual head of the kingdom directly declared that he could not recognize the rights of Infanta Juana, because her origin caused serious doubt. Confronted with the threat of rebellion, Enrique took an unprecedented step. At the Cortes in Burgos, he publicly raised the question of paternity and agreed to set aside his daughter in favor of his younger brother Alfonso. Moreover, he proposed a strange solution, to marry Joan to Alfonso, so that her rights would be strengthened by union with the recognized heir. But the concession brought no peace. Already in June 1465 the rebels performed a demonstrative act. Behind the walls of Avila they built a platform, placed upon it a statue of Enrique dressed in royal robes, and removed from it the symbols of power one after another, the sword, the scepter, the crown. Then the figure was thrown to the ground, and a new monarch, 11-year-old Alfonso, was proclaimed. Thus Castile had two kings at once, and the country plunged into turmoil. The struggle lasted 3 years, but neither side achieved victory. Everything changed suddenly in 1468, when young Alfonso died. The official explanation said it was illness, but many suspected poison. Now all eyes turned to his sister Isabella, who became the new player in the contest for the throne. Isabella, the sister of the late Alfonso, immediately attracted the attention of the nobility. Unlike Enrique, she was resolute, knew how to wait, and could say what the moment required. Her support grew, yet she acted carefully. In September 1468, a treaty was concluded between Enrique and the rebellious nobles. Enrique recognized Isabella as his heiress, thereby depriving his own daughter of her rights. In return, Isabella promised not to marry without the king's approval. However, a year later she broke this condition. In 1469, without Enrique's knowledge, she married Ferdinand of Aragon, the son of the King of Aragon and the brother of that same Juan II who had once imprisoned Blanche of Navarre. The union proved fateful. The two strongest houses of the Pyrenean Peninsula joined into one. Enrique perceived it as betrayal. He once again tried to declare Juana his legitimate heir, but the strength was no longer on his side. The reputation of Beltran's daughter clung firmly to the girl, while Isabella, on the contrary, was seen as the embodiment of legality and the hope for order. When Enrique died in December 1474, Isabella immediately proclaimed herself Queen of Castile. But ahead of her awaited the final battle for the crown. Portugal stood behind Juana, and a long war for succession began. The death of Enrique opened a new chapter in the history of Castile. Isabella did not hesitate even for a moment. Right after the funeral, she declared herself queen. But not everyone was ready to accept this peace. At the same time, the supporters of Juana, the daughter of Joan of Portugal, proclaimed her the rightful heir. The Portuguese king Afonso V, Juana's uncle, immediately married his niece and led his army into Castile. Thus began the war for the Castilian succession, a conflict that decided not only who would wear the crown, but also what the destiny of the entire Iberian Peninsula would become. The troops of Isabella and Ferdinand fought against the forces of Portugal and Juana's supporters. Battles alternated with truces. Sieges were replaced by open fights. One of the decisive encounters was the Battle of Toro in 1476. Both sides proclaimed victory, but in reality it was Isabella and Ferdinand who strengthened their authority afterward. Yet the outcome of the war was determined not only by weapons. Propaganda proved even more powerful. The same rumors once born in Segovia now turned into political weapons. Isabella skillfully reminded everyone that Juana was called the daughter of Beltran, hinting at her doubtful origin. In pamphlets and speeches it was repeated again and again that a child of uncertain birth could not rightfully claim the crown. Gradually Juana's support melted away. Even inside Portugal many began to question whether it was worth fighting a long and exhausting war for such uncertain rights. Finally, in 1479, the peace treaty of Alcacovas was concluded. According to its terms, Portugal renounced its claim to Castile, and Juana had to choose, either marry the young son of Isabella and Ferdinand or withdraw to a convent. Juana chose the convent. There, behind monastic walls, she lived for many years, continuing to sign her letters. I, Juana, by the grace of God, Queen of Castile. But outside those walls no one heard her voice again. In Castile, the power of Isabella and Ferdinand became unquestionable. Their marriage formed the core of the future Spain, and from this union arose the empire that only a few decades later would conquer the New World. But while for Isabella and Ferdinand the war ended in triumph, the fate of Blanche of Navarre, the woman with whom this whole story had begun, turned out to be far more tragic. After the annulment of her marriage, her father kept her imprisoned for many years. Attempts to arrange her marriage to French princes or dukes led to nothing. Blanche refused, realizing that another political match would only repeat the previous trap. When in 1461 her brother Carlos, Prince of Viana, suddenly died during negotiations with their father, suspicion immediately fell upon Juan II. The death of Carlos made Blanche the direct heiress to Navarre, and the Cortes proclaimed her queen, but her authority existed only on paper. Juan II quickly stripped even this illusory title from her, transferring the claims to his younger daughter Eleanor, the wife of Count Gaston, who agreed to accept her father's decision in exchange for her own inheritance. Blanche was forced to sign a document renouncing her rights. Immediately afterward she sent secret letters to her former husband Enrique, pleading for protection. She even offered to recognize him as heir to Navarre if he would help her escape. But Enrique did nothing. His own position in Castile was too unstable for him to intervene. In 1464, at the age of 39, Blanche died in the castle of Orthez. The official explanation mentioned illness, but her contemporaries were certain that she had been poisoned. Her funeral was held without honors, and her grave did not survive. The woman who once could have united two kingdoms passed into oblivion, without title, without family, and even without remembrance. Her death became a warning. In a world where marriage served as a weapon, a woman could only end up a sacrifice on the altar of politics. And yet Blanche's name entered history, not through power, but through tragedy, which became the prologue to the birth of New Spain. The triumph of Isabella and Ferdinand marked a decisive turning point. Their union strengthened not only Castile's throne, but also a new order throughout the entire Iberian Peninsula. The marriage joined the two most powerful kingdoms, Castile and Aragon, and with them their vast resources, armies, and dynastic claims. This alliance would later be called the Catholic monarchy, and from it Spain would emerge in the form we know today. Victory in the war for succession gave Isabella legitimacy, but she understood how to rely not only on military strength. She secured the image of a queen who restored justice, ended chaos, and erased the humiliating scandals of the past. In her propaganda, the story of Enrique and Joan turned into a symbol of disgrace, while she herself became the embodiment of renewed purity and lawful rule. Soon, this image began to work not only inside her own kingdom. Isabella and Ferdinand started to shape foreign policy in which Spain became the central power and focus of Europe. It was they who sponsored Columbus's voyage, and it was their names that were forever linked with the discovery of the New World. In the years that followed, their descendants would lead armies against the Moors, completing the Reconquista and transforming the country into an empire stretching from Granada to the Americas. And all this became possible because of the events in Segovia, because a young prince once failed to fulfill what was considered a duty to the crown. A private drama turned into a turning point in world history. The failure of one wedding night became the beginning of an empire. In the silence of the convent where Joan spent her remaining years, and in the lost grave of Blanche, lies the tragic price of great change. These women, whose lives were used as pawns, ended broken. Yet through their humiliation and downfall, a new dynasty was born.